Billionaire wrote a check for $2 million to his housemaid, and what she did shocked him. Betty Johnson held the check with trembling hands, while Richard Coleman awaited her reaction in the main hall of the mansion. For 22 years, she had worked for that family, always arriving at 6 in the morning and leaving only after dinner was served. But she never imagined that one day she would receive an amount that would completely change her life. That's when she noticed something strange in her employer's smile. It wasn't the expression of someone doing a good deed, but rather of someone buying something very specific. "Mr. Richard, I can't accept this," said Betty, extending the check back. The 53-year-old businessman felt the smile fade from his face. All morning he had rehearsed that moment, calculating every word, every gesture. Betty should have been emotional, grateful, maybe even cried with joy. He never expected a refusal. "Betty, you deserve this and much more. It's 2 decades of dedication to my family," insisted Richard, refusing to take the paper back. "But why now, sir? What happened?" she asked, noticing the anxiety behind the generosity. Richard averted his eyes to the marble staircase. Since he woke up that Tuesday morning, he knew that day would be different. The phone call he received the night before had changed everything. Now he needed to ensure Betty's loyalty at any cost, but she was being smarter than he imagined. "Nothing happened. It's just recognition for your work," he lied, trying to sound convincing. Betty had known Richard Coleman since he was an ambitious young man struggling to expand his father's business. She had seen him celebrate his first big victories, comforted him during the complicated divorce, and taken care of the house when he traveled the world closing $1 million contracts. She knew when he was lying. "Mr. Richard, in all these years working here, you never even gave me an extra Christmas bonus without a very well-thought-out reason. $2 million isn't gratitude. It's payment for silence," stated Betty, surprising herself with her own courage. A heavy silence filled the room. Richard felt cold sweat running down his back as he watched the woman who knew his habits, his quirks, his secrets better than anyone else. Betty had always been discreet, efficient, almost invisible in the mansion's daily life. Now for the first time she was confronting him directly. "What are you talking about?" tried Richard, but his voice came out higher than normal. "I'm talking about the phone call you received last night. I'm talking about how you locked yourself in the office for 3 hours after that. I'm talking about how you burned papers in the fireplace for the first time in years," listed Betty, maintaining a respectful but firm tone. Richard felt the floor disappear beneath his feet. How did she know all that? He had been so careful, waited until he was sure the house was empty before destroying the documents. Or at least, he thought it was empty. "Were you spying on me?" he accused, trying to regain control of the situation. "I was doing my job, Mr. Richard. Cleaning the house, organizing your papers, making sure everything was perfect when you woke up, as I've always done," replied Betty with dignity. At that moment, Richard realized he had completely underestimated the woman before him. For years she had been a constant but silent presence, someone he considered part of the house's furniture. Now he understood that Betty observed everything, knew everything, and probably held information that could destroy him. "All right, Betty, you're too smart for me to try to deceive, but I need your discretion about some delicate matters," admitted Richard, completely changing his strategy. "What kind of matters?" asked Betty, though she already suspected the answer. "Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. This really helps those of us just starting out. Now continuing." Richard walked to the window overlooking the garden, meticulously maintained by gardeners, who came 3 times a week. His construction companies had grown exponentially in recent years, but not everything had been achieved within the law. Fraudulent contracts, bribes to inspectors, partnerships with suppliers who used inferior quality materials. "Betty, do you remember the building that collapsed in Miami 3 years ago?" asked Richard without turning around. Betty felt her stomach tighten. She remembered that terrible day perfectly. Richard had come home pale as a ghost, locked himself in his office for hours making desperate phone calls. For weeks the press had speculated about the causes of the collapse, but the investigation was mysteriously shelved. "Yes, I remember, sir. It was a terrible tragedy," replied Betty, fearing what would come next. Well, yesterday someone called me saying they have proof that my company used inadequate materials in that construction. Documents, contracts, recordings, everything that could send me to prison, confessed Richard, finally turning to face Betty. Betty felt her legs weaken. All those years she had been serving breakfast to a man who carried such a terrible secret. How many families had been destroyed because of his greed? How many lives were lost so he could build his fortune? That's why the check, she murmured, beginning to understand the situation. That's why the check, confirmed Richard. I need time to organize my defense, find a way to resolve this, and I need to be sure that the people close to me won't abandon me in my most difficult moment. Betty looked again at the piece of paper in her hands. $2 million, more money than she could earn in several lifetimes working as a housekeeper. Enough money to buy her own house, give her children a better life, maybe even open the small business she'd always dreamed of. And if I don't accept? Asked Betty, though she already knew there was no real choice. You will accept, replied Richard with his usual confidence, because you know enough about me to know that I always get what I want, one way or another. Betty recognized the veiled threat behind his words. Richard wasn't offering money out of gratitude. He was buying her loyalty and her silence. If she refused, he would find other ways to ensure she didn't talk, ways that could harm not only her, but her family as well. I need time to think, said Betty, putting the check in her apron pocket. You have until tomorrow morning, stipulated Richard. After that, I need a definite answer. Betty nodded and withdrew to the kitchen, leaving Richard alone with his dark thoughts. She knew that night would be one of the longest of her life. How could she accept money stained with so much suffering? But how could she refuse and put her own family at risk? While preparing lunch, Betty couldn't stop thinking about the families who had lost loved ones in the collapse. She had followed the news at the time, seen interviews with desperate relatives, witnessed the collective mourning that took over the city, and now she discovered that the man she worked for was responsible for all that pain. During the afternoon, Richard remained locked in his office, making calls to lawyers and influential contacts. Betty could hear fragments of conversations through the door. I need more time. Find something against him. How much will it cost to resolve this? Every word confirmed her worst suspicions about her boss's character. When it came time to prepare dinner, Betty still hadn't made a decision. Her children, Michael and Jennifer, were already adults with their own families, but they still occasionally depended on her financial help. Michael had been unemployed for 6 months, and Jennifer was struggling to pay for her young son's medical treatment. The money could solve all these problems, but accepting would mean becoming Richard's accomplice, condoning his criminal actions. Betty had been raised by her grandmother with solid values, honesty, integrity, justice. How could she betray all that now? At 9 in the evening, when she finished cleaning the kitchen, Betty made a decision that would surprise everyone. Instead of going home as she did every night, she went up to Richard's office and knocked on the door. "Come in," said Richard, looking up from the documents scattered on his desk. "Mr. Richard, I've made my decision," announced Betty, taking the check out of her pocket. Richard smiled, already imagining she had accepted the offer. After all, Betty was a simple, hard-working woman who would certainly understand the unique opportunity being offered. "Great, Betty. I knew you'd understand," said Richard, extending his hand to shake hers. But Betty did not return the gesture. Instead, she placed the check on the table and pushed it back toward Richard. "I can't accept this money," declared Betty in a firm voice. Richard felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. All day he had taken it for granted that Betty would accept the proposal. It was too generous an amount for someone in her social position to refuse. "Betty, you're making a very big mistake," warned Richard, trying to stay calm. "Maybe I am. But it's my mistake to make," replied Betty. "I can't accept money knowing where it comes from and what it's for." "You don't understand the consequences of what you're doing," insisted Richard, his voice growing tenser. "I understand perfectly. I'm choosing to be able to sleep peacefully every night for the rest of my life," explained Betty. "Dirty money doesn't bring happiness to anyone." Richard stood up from his chair, clearly irritated. For years he had controlled every difficult situation by buying people's loyalty. Public officials, suppliers, Even some journalists had accepted his offers without question. Betty was the first person to refuse. "And what do you intend to do now?" asked Richard with a threatening tone. "I'll keep doing my job until you decide to let me go. But I won't accept money to stay quiet about something I consider wrong," replied Betty, standing firm despite the fear she felt. "Betty, you're underestimating the power I have. I can make your life very difficult," Richard threatened openly. "Maybe so, Mr. Richard, but you're also underestimating something. For 22 years I've taken care of this house as if it were my own. I know every corner, every drawer, every paper that's ever passed through here," said Betty, with a courage she didn't know she possessed. Richard felt a chill. What was Betty implying? That she had compromising information about him? For years he had been careless with documents and conversations in front of her, treating her as if she were invisible. Now he began to realize the mistake he had made. "What do you mean by that?" asked Richard, trying to disguise his nervousness. "I mean that maybe it's best for all of us if things continue as they always have. You remain my boss, I remain your employee, and we each go about our lives without complications," proposed Betty diplomatically. Richard realized he had fallen into his own trap. By trying to buy Betty, he had revealed information she could use against him. Now she knew about the collapse and possibly other irregularities she had observed over the years. "All right, Betty, let's forget this conversation," agreed Richard, putting the check in the drawer. "Thank you, Mr. Richard." "Excuse me," said Betty, leaving the office with her dignity intact. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out, now continuing. That night, Betty arrived home in the small apartment in Queens with mixed feelings. On one hand, she felt proud of having stood by her principles. On the other, she feared the consequences of having challenged Richard Coleman. She knew her boss's temperament well and knew he wouldn't easily forget the humiliation of having his offer refused. In the following days, the atmosphere in the mansion became tense. Richard avoided speaking with Betty beyond what was strictly necessary, while she continued doing her work as always, but with extra caution. Both knew something had irreversibly changed in their relationship. A week later, Betty noticed Richard was receiving strange visitors, men in dark suits who arrived in expensive cars and spent hours locked in the office. The conversations were always in low voices, but Betty could catch scattered words: investigation, evidence, witnesses. It was then that she understood the situation was more serious than she had imagined. Richard wasn't just worried about possible blackmail, but facing an official investigation. The phone call he had received was probably from someone connected to the authorities, warning him about what was to come. On a Thursday morning, Betty was cleaning the office when she found forgotten documents on the table. They were copies of contracts from the time of the building's construction that had collapsed, with handwritten notes in the margins. One of the notes caught her attention: second-rate materials approved to reduce costs by 40%. Betty felt nauseous reading those numbers. Richard had consciously chosen to save money by using inadequate materials, knowing the risks it represented. It wasn't an accident or negligence, but a calculated decision that cost human lives. At that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of simply ignoring what she had seen, Betty decided to do something she had never done before. She took photos of the documents with her old cell phone. She didn't know exactly what she would do with those images, but she felt she needed to preserve the evidence. During the rest of the week, Betty observed Richard more carefully. She noticed he was losing weight, sleeping poorly, drinking more whiskey than usual. The pressure was clearly affecting his physical and mental health. Sometimes she even felt sorry for him, remembering the younger and seemingly honest man she had met years ago. Over the weekend, Betty received an unexpected call. It was Catherine, Richard's ex-wife, with whom she had kept sporadic contact even after the divorce. "Betty, I need to talk to you. It's about Richard," said Catherine with a worried voice. "What happened, Mrs. Catherine?" asked Betty, surprised by the call. "I'm hearing he's involved in serious trouble. My daughter, Amanda, is very worried about her father," explained Catherine. Amanda was Richard's daughter from his first marriage, a 28-year-old young woman who worked as a lawyer in a prestigious firm. Betty knew Richard was very proud of his daughter, and would do anything to protect her. "Do you want me to say something to him?" offered Betty. "Actually, I wanted to know if you could talk to me in person." "There are things I can't discuss over the phone," said Catherine mysteriously. Betty agreed to meet Catherine over the weekend. When she arrived at the cafe where they had arranged to meet, she found a visibly shaken woman. Catherine had aged since the last time they had seen each other and wore an expression of deep concern. "Betty, you've always been someone I could trust. That's why I decided to reach out to you," Catherine began. "Richard is involved in something very dangerous, and I fear it could affect our daughter." "Do you know what it's about?" asked Betty cautiously. "I know it's related to the collapse of that building in Miami. I have a journalist friend who's investigating the case and told me they found incriminating evidence," revealed Catherine. Betty felt her heart race. The information she had uncovered was being confirmed by other sources. Richard's situation was indeed serious. "But why are you telling me this?" asked Betty. "Because I know you have access to the house, the documents, the information, and because I know you're an honest person who wouldn't condone injustices," explained Catherine. Betty realized that Catherine was practically asking her to become an informant. Richard's ex-wife wanted to protect their daughter and saw Betty as someone who could provide information about her ex-husband's plans. "Mrs. Catherine, this is very complicated. He's been my boss for over 20 years, said Betty, torn between loyalty and justice. "I understand completely, Betty, but think of the families that were destroyed because of his greed. You have the power to help bring about justice," argued Catherine. That night, Betty stayed up late thinking about the conversation. On one hand, she felt uncomfortable with the idea of spying on Richard. On the other, she couldn't forget the notes she had seen in the documents, clear proof that he had put profit above human lives. The following Monday, Betty returned to work with renewed determination. She decided she would pay closer attention to Richard's movements, not to harm him, but to protect others who could be affected by his actions. During the week, Betty noticed that Richard was receiving visits from a man she didn't know. He was a suspicious-looking individual, always wearing sunglasses and speaking in a low voice. On one occasion, she managed to catch fragments of the conversation. "Need to leave the country, overseas accounts, change of identity." Betty realized that Richard was planning to flee. If he managed to leave the United States, he would never be held accountable for the crimes he had committed. The families of the collapse victims would never see justice. It was then that she made the most difficult decision of her life. Betty decided to contact the authorities and provide the information she had. It wasn't an easy decision, as it meant betraying the trust of someone she had worked for decades, but she felt it was the right thing to do. Betty arranged a meeting with a detective who was investigating the collapse case. She brought the photos she had taken of the documents and told him everything she knew about Richard's plans. The detective was impressed with the quality of the evidence and assured Betty that she would be protected as a witness. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. 2 days later, Betty arrived at the mansion in the morning to find a chaotic scene. There were police cars in front of the house and agents searching Richard's office. He was sitting in the living room, handcuffed, with a look of complete defeat on his face. When Richard saw Betty, his eyes filled with a rage she had never seen before. "It was you, wasn't it?" he accused, his voice trembling with hatred. Betty didn't respond, but her silence was confirmation enough. Richard began to scream, calling her a traitor, ungrateful, a snake he had nurtured at his own breast. The police officers had to restrain him to keep him from getting up from the chair. "Mr. Richard, you had the chance to do the right thing. You offered money to buy my silence, but not to repair the harm you caused," said Betty, keeping her composure despite the pain she felt. "You destroyed my life," shouted Richard as he was being taken away by the police. "No, Mr. Richard. You destroyed your own life when you decided to put money above human lives," replied Betty with tears in her eyes. In the following days, Richard Coleman's arrest dominated the news. The evidence provided by Betty was crucial to proving his responsibility in the collapse. The case gained national attention, and Betty found herself at the center of a media storm. Many people called her a heroine for having the courage to report her boss, Others criticized her for betraying someone who gave her a job. Betty tried to ignore the comments and focus on the fact that she had done what she considered right. Amanda, Richard's daughter, sought out Betty a few weeks after her father's arrest. The young lawyer was visibly shaken, but wanted to better understand what had happened. "Betty, you've known my father longer than anyone else." "Was he always like this?" asked Amanda, her eyes red from crying. "No, Miss Amanda. Your father wasn't always like this. I think money and power changed him little by little, until he lost sight of what really matters in life," replied Betty honestly. "Did you do the right thing by reporting him?" asked Amanda, needing to hear confirmation from someone she trusted. "I did what my conscience told me to. I can't say if it was right or wrong, but I can say it was necessary," replied Betty. Amanda hugged Betty and cried in her arms like she did when she was a child. The young woman had lost not only her father, but also the image she had of him as a hero. Betty comforted her as best she could, explaining that sometimes the people we love disappoint us. But that doesn't mean the love we felt for them was false. Months later, during Richard's trial, Betty was called to testify. It was one of the most difficult experiences of her life, having to recount in detail everything she knew about her former boss's criminal actions. Richard was present in the courtroom, and she avoided looking directly at him. When it was his turn to speak, Richard made one last attempt to attack Betty. "Your Honor, this woman worked for me for years. She had access to privileged information and is now using it against me out of revenge," claimed Richard. "Revenge for what?" asked the judge. "For refusing to accept a bonus I offered her," replied Richard, not realizing he was incriminating himself even further. The judge asked Betty about this bonus, and she told the whole truth about the $2 million check and the circumstances under which it was offered. The court was shocked to learn that Richard had tried to buy Betty's silence right after discovering he was under investigation. "And why did you refuse to accept the money?" asked the prosecutor. "Because it would mean accepting that human lives have a price, sir. And to me, that is priceless," replied Betty, moving everyone in the courtroom. Richard was sentenced to 15 years in prison for qualified manslaughter and corruption. The sentence brought some relief to the victims' families, who finally saw justice being served. Betty lost her job, obviously, but soon received several job offers from people who admired her courage. She chose to work for a simple family who treated her with respect and dignity. 1 year after Richard's imprisonment, Betty received an unexpected visit. It was Amanda, who had completely changed her life after the trauma of discovering the truth about her father. "Betty, I have a proposal for you," said Amanda, sitting down in the small living room of the apartment where Betty lived. "What kind of proposal, Mrs. Amanda?" asked Betty, curious. "I want to create an organization to help families affected by tragedies caused by corporate negligence, and I want you to be my partner," explained Amanda. Betty was surprised by the proposal. Amanda had decided to use her legal knowledge to fight for justice, inspired by the courage Betty had shown. "But I don't have the education for that, Mrs. Amanda," said Betty, unsure. "You have something much more valuable than education, character, and life experience. You were the one who taught me that doing the right thing is sometimes hard, but it's always worth it," argued Amanda. Betty accepted the proposal, and together they created an organization that became a reference in the fight for the rights of victims of preventable tragedies. The work was rewarding, as it allowed Betty to help other people going through situations similar to the families affected by the collapse. Years passed, and Betty became a respected figure in the fight for social justice. She received invitations to speak at universities and conferences, telling her story as an example that ordinary people can make a difference when they have the courage to do the right thing. At one of these lectures, Betty met one of the daughters of a victim of the collapse. The young woman had lost her mother in the tragedy and grew up with her grandmother under difficult conditions. "Mrs. Betty, I wanted to thank you for what you did. Because of your courage, my family finally got justice," said the young woman, emotional. "Dear, I only did what any decent person should do. The credit goes to people like you, who never gave up searching for the truth," replied Betty humbly. "You saved our faith in justice. When we found out that the person responsible was arrested, we felt that our mother could finally rest in peace," continued the young woman. Betty hugged the girl and cried with her. In those moments, she felt that all the difficulties she had faced were worth it. The money she refused could never buy the peace of mind she felt knowing she had helped bring about justice. During the following years, Betty kept in sporadic contact with Richard through Amanda. He had changed a lot in prison, showing genuine remorse for the crimes he had committed. In a letter he sent through his daughter, Richard asked Betty for forgiveness for threatening her and acknowledged that she had done the right thing. "He wants to see you, Betty. He says he needs to apologize in person," Amanda told her during a visit. "I don't know if I can, Mrs. Amanda. It still hurts to think about how that man I respected was capable of so much cruelty," confessed Betty. "I understand completely. But maybe it's important for both of you. For him to redeem himself, for you to find definitive peace," suggested Amanda. Betty decided to visit Richard in prison. She found an aged man, thin, with completely grey hair. Nothing remained of the arrogance and self-importance he had shown when he was free. "Betty, thank you for coming," said Richard, with a trembling voice. "How are you, sir?" asked Betty, still maintaining the respectful address as always. "I'm paying for my mistakes, and I know I deserve to be here," replied Richard, surprising Betty with his honesty. "You've changed a lot," observed Betty. "Prison made me reflect on many things, mainly about how I treated the people who were always loyal to me like you," said Richard with tears in his eyes. "Mr. Richard, I didn't report you out of revenge or anger. I did it because it was the right thing to do," explained Betty. "I know that now, and I also know that you gave me a chance to do the right thing when you refused the money. But I was blinded by greed and fear," admitted Richard. "The important thing is that you recognize this now," said Betty, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. "Betty, I want you to know I'm helping authorities investigate other similar cases. I can't undo the harm I caused, but I can try to prevent other business owners from making the same mistakes," Richard shared. "That makes me happy, Mr. Richard. It shows you've truly changed," said Betty, feeling something like forgiveness in her heart. When she left the prison, Betty felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. The meeting with Richard had been crucial for her to finally forgive and move forward with her life. Amanda was waiting for Betty outside the prison, anxious to know how the meeting had gone. "How was it?" asked Amanda. "Your father is truly remorseful. I think he finally understood the gravity of what he did," replied Betty. "That gives me hope that one day we might have a normal relationship again," said Amanda, emotional. "Forgiveness takes time to come, Miss Amanda, but it always comes when the person is truly sorry," comforted Betty. In the following years, Betty continued her work at the organization she created with Amanda. They helped hundreds of families obtain justice in cases of corporate negligence, becoming one of the leading voices in the fight for corporate accountability in the country. Betty also returned to studying, completing her high school education at 60, and then taking a technical course in social management. She proved to herself and everyone that it's never too late to seek knowledge and personal growth. One December afternoon, Betty was organizing documents at the organization's office when she received a call that would change her life once again. "Hello, is this Betty Johnson?" asked an unfamiliar female voice. "Yes, speaking. Who am I talking to?" replied Betty. "My name is Olivia Parker. I'm a journalist writing a book about people who had the courage to report injustices. I'd like to include your story," the woman explained. "I'm not sure my story is that interesting," said Betty modestly. "Ms. Johnson, your story has inspired thousands of people. It shows that anyone can make a difference when they have courage and determination," insisted Olivia. Betty agreed to participate in the project. The book was published 2 years later and became a national bestseller. Betty's story inspired a new generation of people to fight against injustices, regardless of their social position. During the book launch, Betty was invited to speak to an audience of over 1,000 people. It was the largest crowd she had ever faced, and she was nervous. "Dear people, I'm not a writer or a professional speaker. I'm just an ordinary woman who one day found herself facing a difficult choice," Betty began, immediately winning the audience's sympathy. "Many ask me if I regret refusing those $2 million. The answer is no. Money buys many things, but it doesn't buy peace of mind. And there's no price that can pay for the feeling of having done the right thing," Betty continued. The audience rose in a prolonged standing ovation. Betty had become a symbol of integrity and courage for people of all ages and social classes. After the speech, Betty was approached by a woman about her age. "Betty, my name is Dorothy. I lost my son in the building collapse in Miami," said the woman, emotional. Betty felt her heart tighten. It was the first time she had met in person a mother who had lost a child in the tragedy. "Dorothy, I'm so sorry for your loss," said Betty, hugging the woman. "I wanted to thank you for having the courage to report that man. My son finally got justice because of your bravery," said Dorothy, crying. "I did what any mother would do for another mother's children," replied Betty, also emotional. "My son's name was Robert. He was a civil engineer and always dreamed of building safe homes for people. The irony is that he fell victim to the very greed he always fought against," Dorothy shared. Betty cried with Dorothy, feeling the weight of the responsibility she had taken on by exposing Richard. It wasn't just about abstract justice, but about real lives, shattered dreams, broken families. "Robert would be proud to know that your courage helped prevent other families from going through what we did," said Dorothy. "I hope so. I hope all this pain has served some purpose," Betty replied. In the following months, Betty dedicated herself even more to her work at the organization. The conversation with Dorothy had renewed her determination to fight for justice and corporate accountability. At a board meeting of the organization, Amanda brought forward a surprising proposal. "Betty, we've received an offer from an international foundation to expand our work to other countries in Latin America," Amanda announced. "That's wonderful, Ms. Amanda, but I don't speak other languages," said Betty, concerned. "You don't need to. Your story speaks for itself. We want you to be the organization's spokesperson, sharing your experience to inspire others," Amanda explained. Betty accepted the challenge. In the following years, she traveled to various countries telling her story and helping establish similar organizations. She discovered that corruption and corporate negligence were global problems and that her experience could help people in different cultures. On a trip to Puerto Rico, Betty met Sarah, a woman who had lost her family in an earthquake caused by inadequate construction. Sarah's story was eerily similar to that of the victims of the collapse in Miami. "Betty, your story gave me strength to fight against those responsible for my family's death," said Sarah. "Sarah, the strength was always within you. I just showed you that it's possible to fight and win," Betty replied. "But you showed that an ordinary person can bring down a powerful man when truth is on their side," Sarah insisted. Betty realized her story had transcended national borders and become a universal symbol that justice is possible when people are willing to fight for it. At 70 years old, Betty decided to retire from active work at the organization, but remained as an advisor and occasional speaker. She had fulfilled her mission of turning a painful situation into strength for good. One quiet afternoon in her apartment, Betty received an unexpected letter. It was from Richard, who had been released after serving his sentence. "Dear Betty," the letter said, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I dedicated my last years in prison to studying and preparing for a new life. After my release, I created a consulting company that helps other businesses implement ethical construction practices. It's my way of trying to repair even minimally the harm I caused. You taught me that it's never too late to change, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving I've learned that lesson. With admiration and respect, Richard Coleman." Betty smiled as she read the letter. Richard had truly changed and found a constructive way to deal with his past. It was proof that redemption is possible for anyone who has the courage to acknowledge their mistakes and work to make amends. That same day, Betty wrote in her diary, "Today marks 15 years since I refused that check. It was the most difficult decision of my life, but also the most important. I learned that money can buy many things, but it cannot buy dignity, honor, or peace of mind. These things can only be earned through our choices and actions. I am grateful I had the courage to make the right choice, even when it seemed impossible." Years later, Betty was honored by the government with a Medal of Honor for her contribution to social justice. During the ceremony, she dedicated the honor to all people who have the courage to do the right thing, even when it's hard. "This medal isn't mine. It belongs to all those who choose justice over convenience, truth over silence, the common good over personal benefit," said Betty in her speech. 15 years ago, a man offered me $2 million to stay silent about a crime. I refused because I understood that there are things in life that are priceless. Integrity is one of them, justice is another, and peace of mind is the most valuable of all," Betty continued. The audience was moved by Betty's words. She had become much more than a housekeeper who reported her employer. She had become a symbol that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when guided by strong principles. After the ceremony, Betty was approached by a young journalist. "Mrs. Johnson, what advice would you give to people who find themselves in situations similar to yours?" asked the journalist. "I would tell them to listen to their conscience. When we know something is wrong, our heart warns us. The hard part is having the courage to act according to our conscience, especially when it might harm us," replied Betty. "And if the person is afraid of the consequences?" asked the journalist. "Fear is natural and even healthy, but we can't let fear stop us from doing what's right. Sometimes doing the right thing is scary, but the consequences of not doing it are always worse," explained Betty. "Do you feel your life changed for the better after that decision?" asked the journalist. "My life became harder in many ways, but it also became more meaningful. I prefer a difficult but dignified life to an easy but dishonest one," Betty replied with conviction. That night, Betty returned home thinking about the long journey she had taken since the day she refused the $2 million check. She had lost a secure job, faced threats, been criticized by many people, but she had also helped bring about justice, inspired others, and found a greater purpose for her life. Looking in the mirror before bed, Betty saw a 75-year-old woman who carried wrinkles earned through years of hard work and worry, but who also carried a special sparkle in her eyes. It was the sparkle of someone who could look at herself with pride and at the future with hope. The next day, Betty woke up early as she always did and prepared her black coffee without sugar. As she drank her coffee and looked out the window of her simple but cozy apartment, she thought about all the people her decision had affected, the victims' families who finally got justice, Richard who had the opportunity to redeem himself, Amanda who found a new purpose in life, and so many others who were inspired to fight for their principles. Betty smiled as she realized that $2 million check, which at the time seemed like the opportunity of a lifetime, would actually have been the worst bargain she could have made. By refusing it, she had gained something much more valuable, self-respect, and the certainty that she had made a difference in the world. End of story. And you? What do you think about the decision Betty made? Do you believe she did the right thing by refusing the money and reporting Richard? Share your opinion in the comments. We really want to know what you think about this story of courage and integrity. If this narrative touched your heart, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories like this one.